Sir, I bring grave news that must be delivered to you at once.
What has happened? Why are you so distressed?
The Parthians, sir. The Parthians have invaded Armenia, driven back the forces of Paetus, and now hold him and his army trapped within their camp. If we do not move immediately, Armenia will be lost, and many Romans will perish.
So at last, what I feared has come to pass. When I warned him not to rush, he would not listen. Now both winter and the enemy stand against him. Prepare the troops for march, at once.
Between 58 and 60 AD, Corbulo, commander of the Roman forces in the east, led a successful campaign in Armenia. He drove back the Armenian Parthian forces of Tiridates and once again brought Armenia under Roman influence. Emperor Nero entrusted the Armenian throne to Tigranes and appointed Corbulo as successor to the deceased governor of Syria. Nevertheless, both Nero and Corbulo understood that this victory would not remain secure so long as the main Parthian army under the command of Vologases still stood intact. In 61 AD, Tigranes, the newly appointed and ambitious king of Armenia, took advantage of the Parthians' preoccupation in Hyrcania. With the forces Corbulo had placed at his disposal, together with native Armenian troops, he invaded the northern regions of Adiabene within the Parthian Empire, carrying out plunder and devastation. King Monobaz II immediately wrote to Vologases and informed him of the situation. Vologases clearly understood the seriousness of the situation confronting him. To preserve his authority and prestige among the Parthian nobility, he had to respond without delay. For this reason, he entered negotiations with the Hyrcanian rebels in an effort to end the unrest and concluded a temporary peace with them. The king then summoned the royal council, likely the Mahestan assembly. Nobles from across the empire gathered, and before them, Vologases formally proclaimed Tiridates king of Armenia. He then fastened the royal diadem upon his brow and addressed the assembled nobles, saying, "Although this man, born of the same father as myself, had conceded the supreme name to me by reason of age, I escorted him to the possession of Armenia, which is regarded as the third rank in powerfulness. And I seemed, contrary to the old hatreds and competitions of brothers, to have achieved a proper settlement for our family's household gods. But the Romans are preventing it, and the peace, which they have never challenged with advantage to themselves, they are now again severing to their own extermination. I shall not embark on denial. I should have preferred to retain, by fairness rather than by bloodshed, by reason rather than by arms, the acquisitions of our ancestors. If I have failed through hesitation, I shall rectify it through courage. At least your strength and glory remain intact, with the addition of a reputation for modestness which is not to be spurned by the highest of mortals and is valued by the gods." With this symbolic coronation, Vologases declared before all that, at any cost, he would restore Parthian influence in Armenia and revive the legacy of the Achaemenid Empire. After Tiridates' coronation ceremony concluded before the royal council, Vologases began organizing his forces for a counteroffensive against the Romans. He placed some of his finest cavalry under Tiridates' command and ordered him to invade Armenia together with the army of the king of Adiabene. Vologases himself marched with the remainder of his forces toward northern Mesopotamia to assess the possibility of launching an attack against Syria. Corbulo, who was closely monitoring Parthian movements, reacted immediately. First, he entrusted the 4th Legion Scythica and the 12th Legion Fulminata to Verulanus Severus and Vettius Belanus, ordering them to proceed without delay into Armenia and defend the province. He gave them strict instructions to act with utmost caution and avoid any recklessness or premature engagement. He himself then marched toward the Euphrates, together with the 3rd Legion Gallica, the 6th Legion Ferrata, and the 10th Legion Fretensis, all of which had been reinforced with fresh troops. He fortified the Euphrates frontier with a chain of forts and outposts, securing all major crossings and routes and making any Parthian advance into Syria virtually impossible. Corbulo also sent Nero a detailed report regarding developments in the east, explaining the severity of the situation to the emperor. He wrote that he could not simultaneously defend Syria and manage the war in Armenia, and therefore requested that Nero appoint a new legate to command operations in Armenia. At the same time as Corbulo's preparations, Monobaz and Tiridates were making ready for a surprise invasion of Armenia. They attempted to conceal the movement of their forces in hopes of crushing Tigranes' army through a sudden assault. However, Tigranes learned of the Parthian movements in time. He immediately withdrew his forces from Adiabene and took refuge behind the walls of Tigranocerta. By his order, Armenian officials hurriedly began gathering provisions into the city. In 61 AD, the combined forces of Parthia and Adiabene, under the command of Monobaz and Tiridates, approached the city of Tigranocerta. As they neared the city, Parthian scouts spotted a supply caravan moving toward the city gates. A group of swift Parthian cavalrymen immediately galloped their horses forward and surrounded the convoy. After capturing and interrogating the caravan personnel, Monobaz and Tiridates learned that the city was heavily fortified and possessed sufficient provisions to endure a long siege. The Parthian Adiabenian army drew up its forces before the city and prepared for an assault on the walls. Since the Parthians possessed little expertise in siege warfare and assaults against fortified cities, the task of constructing siege engines and carrying out the attack was entrusted to the infantry of Adiabene. Once the ladders and other siege machinery had been prepared, the Adiabenian infantry advanced toward the city walls. To support their comrades, the Parthian mounted archers galloped toward the city and exchanged volleys with the Roman Armenian defenders stationed atop the walls. Though Parthian archers were deadly upon the open plains, they could not exert the same effectiveness in siege warfare. According to Tacitus, the Parthian has no hand-to-hand daring for the execution of blockades. With his occasional arrows, he cannot terrify those shut inside, and he becomes frustrated. Under the cover of the mounted archers' volleys, the Adiabenian infantry reached the base of the walls and began climbing the ladders. A fierce clash erupted as the Adiabenian troops struggled to scale the walls against the Roman Armenian defenders, who held the advantage from atop the battlements. After a brutal clash, the Romans succeeded in driving the attackers back with ease. At that very moment, the city gates suddenly swung open, and another force of Roman legionaries charged out of the city and fell upon the Adiabenian troops. Tacitus describes the events that followed in these words. When the Adiabeni began to move up ladders and machines, they were easily dislodged and then, as our men burst out, slaughtered. Realizing that he could not defeat the Roman forces, Monobaz immediately gave the order to withdraw. The Parthian Adiabenian army barely managed to pull away from the Roman forces and retreat. The assault on Tigranocerta ended in defeat for the Parthian Adiabenian army. Following the victory at Tigranocerta, Corbulo sent a centurion named Casperius as an envoy to Vologases with the following message: "You had better give up the siege, or I too will encamp in your territory as on hostile ground." Though eager to continue the war, Vologases understood that the Roman legionaries stationed inside Tigranocerta made the capture of the city virtually impossible. Meanwhile, a massive locust plague had ravaged the grasslands of the region, posing a grave threat to the Parthian army, which depended almost entirely on cavalry. Faced with mounting logistical and military difficulties, Vologases ultimately agreed to a temporary settlement. It was decided that both sides, the Parthians as well as the Romans, would withdraw their forces from Armenia. Afterwards, Parthian envoys were dispatched to Rome for direct negotiations with Emperor Nero. Little information survives concerning the details of these negotiations. The outcome, however, is clear. The negotiations ended in failure, and the two great powers once again prepared for war. Around the same time, Lucius Caesennius Paetus, the new legate of Cappadocia, arrived in the east to assume command of the Armenian War. It was rumored that the news of his appointment had discouraged Corbulo from fighting rather than negotiating in the previous year, for he did not want to begin a campaign only to be replaced and let another man finish it. Tacitus does not neglect to mention that some people said that Corbulo was also afraid to risk suffering any reverse which might dent his record of unbroken success. The new Roman legate, Paetus, was not an experienced commander. He possessed no notable military background and even harbored jealousy toward Corbulo's reputation. Nevertheless, upon his arrival in the east, it was decided that the Roman forces stationed in Syria would be divided equally between him and Corbulo. Corbulo retained the three more experienced legions, the 6th Legion Ferrata, the 3rd Legion Gallica, and the 10th Legion Fretensis, under his own command, while the remaining two legions, the 4th Legion Scythica and the 12th Legion Fulminata, were entrusted to Paetus. Around the same time, a newly arrived and inexperienced legion, the 5th Legion Macedonica, was sent to the east and placed under Paetus's command. This division of forces suggests that Corbulo deliberately kept under his command the seasoned forces whom he had personally trained, while the newly arrived and less experienced troops were handed over to Paetus. The latter either could not or did not have sufficient time to implement similar training programs. Much like the tense relationship that had once existed between Corbulo and Quadratus, rivalry and distrust also emerged between the two new legates. Paetus sought to prove that he was an independent commander rather than subordinate to his renowned colleague, and he was eager to rival or even surpass Corbulo in military achievement. Corbulo, for his part, showed little enthusiasm for assisting Paetus in his mission. With the arrival of autumn, the flames of war erupted once again. Vologases departed from Ctesiphon with his army and selected Nisibis as his headquarters. The choice was highly strategic, for Nisibis lay close to both Syria and Armenia, allowing the Parthians to campaign against either front as circumstances demanded. After establishing himself there, Vologases dispatched a group of cavalry scouts toward the Euphrates to assess the positions and movements of the Roman forces. When news arrived that Parthian horsemen had been sighted near the Euphrates, Corbulo immediately left his headquarters at Antioch and marched toward the river in order to prevent a possible invasion. Seeking to place even greater pressure upon the Parthians, he decided to cross the Euphrates and establish his camps along its eastern bank. Parthian forces took up positions along the riverbank in an attempt to prevent the Roman crossing. However, Corbulo effectively supported the troops constructing the bridge by employing large ships equipped with towering structures and ballistae. Whenever the Parthians approached, they were driven back by Roman artillery fire. Unable to halt the crossing, the Parthians withdrew, and the Roman forces successfully crossed the river and constructed fortifications atop a hill near the Euphrates. By securing the Euphrates frontier, Corbulo had made any direct Parthian assault on Syria nearly impossible. Almost simultaneously with Corbulo's actions on the southern front, in the north, Paetus, who regarded Corbulo's cautious strategy with contempt, sought to transform Armenia into a Roman province through a bold and rapid campaign. For his campaign in Armenia, Paetus relied solely upon the 4th Legion Scythica and the 12th Legion Fulminata. As the newly arrived, the 5th Legion Macedonica was not yet ready for battle. Ignoring ominous signs and warnings, the Roman forces crossed the Taurus Mountains and advanced toward Tigranocerta. Paetus acted hastily in preparing for the Armenian campaign and failed to secure sufficient supplies and provisions. Unlike Corbulo during the Armenian campaign, who had patiently established winter bases stocked with adequate food and equipment, Paetus had made none of these preparations. The campaign began successfully. Several fortresses quickly fell, bringing considerable plunder into Roman hands. However, with the arrival of winter, the Roman army began suffering from shortages of provisions and was eventually forced to withdraw. Paetus established a winter camp near the Cappadocian frontier, intending to remain there for the season. Emboldened by his recent successes, Paetus wrote Nero a self-assured letter exaggerating his accomplishments. On the other side, the Parthians had been closely observing Roman movements and judged the moment ideal for a counter-offensive. The routes leading into Syria were heavily guarded by Corbulo, and thus, when Vologases learned of Paetus's recklessness in Armenia, he wasted no time. Although the campaigning season had ended and winter had already begun, the Parthian king departed from Nisibis and marched against the Roman forces encamped at Rhandeia. Remarkably, the Parthians had managed to conceal the movement of their army from Corbulo himself. When they entered Armenia, Paetus had no expectation whatsoever of a Parthian advance. In the winter of 62 AD, the Romans returned to their winter camp at Rhandeia after a short campaign in Armenia that resulted in the rapid fall of several fortresses and the plundering of many towns. Confident that the enemy would never dare campaign in the depths of winter, Paetus made a number of reckless decisions that dangerously weakened his army. He left the 5th Legion Macedonica behind in Pontus, while the other 2 legions had also been dangerously weakened after many soldiers and officers were granted leave. At that moment, news reached Paetus that Parthian forces were drawing near. Paetus's confidence suddenly turned to panic. At first, he intended to remain inside the camp, but he abruptly changed his mind. The 12th Legion Fulminata was recalled, and Paetus marched out from the camp with all his available forces in order to confront the Parthians. According to Tacitus, Paetus shouted among his soldiers, "I had been given neither ditch nor rampart, but only bodies and arms with which to fight the enemy." Paetus dispatched a number of troops ahead of the main army in order to scout the position of the Parthians. Several cavalrymen and light infantrymen broke away from the column and advanced as the vanguard of the Roman force. The Roman scouts soon encountered the vanguard of the Parthian army. The swift Parthian horsemen gave them no opportunity to react and immediately charged the Roman forces. Under a heavy rain of arrows and the crushing assault of the Cataphracts, a centurion and a number of Roman soldiers were slain, while the survivors fled in terror. When Paetus saw the shattered condition of his reconnaissance troops, he was overcome with fear. Though he had marched out seeking a decisive battle, he suddenly ordered a retreat. The Roman forces withdrew in haste and confusion toward their winter camp at Rhandeia. Despite the chaos within the Roman army, when news of the disorganized Roman retreat was brought to Vologases, he refused to pursue them recklessly. Maintaining his composure, the Parthian king preferred to advance cautiously and in good order toward the Roman position. As the distance between the Roman and Parthian armies widened, Paetus stationed around 3,000 infantry on the neighboring ridges of the Taurus Mountains to block the Parthian advance. He also deployed the Pannonian wingmen, who formed the hard core of his mounted forces across the plain before the mountains. He then withdrew with the remainder of his forces toward the camp. Paetus also dispatched a cohort, together with his wife and son, to the city of Tigranocerta, where they were to seek refuge. The pride of the young and inexperienced Roman legate prevented him from openly admitting the severity of his situation to Corbulo. Under pressure from his own soldiers, he reluctantly wrote to Corbulo that the enemy was pursuing him, though he still concealed the true scale of the crisis. When Paetus's request for assistance reached Corbulo, he showed little urgency in coming to his aid. It appears that Corbulo wished to arrive at the very last moment and play the role of savior. Nevertheless, he marched toward Armenia with 1,000 men from each of his 3 legions, 800 cavalrymen, and an equal number of auxiliary cohorts. On the other side of the battlefield, the Parthians first turned their attention toward the Roman cavalry deployed upon the plain. Tacitus gives us no detailed account of the engagement, yet it appears that the Parthians, nearly unbeatable upon open ground, initially advanced with their light cavalry and showered the Romans with arrows. In response, the Roman horsemen charged toward the Parthians, but the light cavalry began a feigned retreat while continuing to fire behind them. In an instant, the mounted archers split into 2 groups and moved toward the flanks. Through the clouds of dust emerged the heavily armored Cataphracts, charging at full speed directly into the Roman cavalry. Before long, large numbers of Roman horsemen lay dead upon the field, while the terrified survivors fled the battlefield in panic. With the Roman cavalry driven from the field, the Parthians advanced toward the heights of the Taurus Mountains, where 3,000 Roman infantry had taken position. Once again, Tacitus provides us with no detailed description of the battle. However, based upon our understanding of Parthian warfare, the Parthians most likely surrounded the Roman infantry with their light horsemen and unleashed volleys of arrows upon them from every direction. The Roman ranks gradually weakened under the relentless missile fire. At that decisive moment, the Cataphracts advanced, and despite the Romans holding the high ground, shattered them with a devastating charge. Many were killed, others wounded, and those who managed to escape the battlefield barely succeeded in reaching Rhandeia. Tacitus writes, "By threats and by force respectively, Vologases terrified the Pannonian wingmen and crushed the legionaries." With the destruction of the Roman infantry positioned in the Taurus Mountains and the elite Pannonian cavalry, the road toward the Roman camp now lay open before the Parthians. Paetus immediately dispatched another messenger to Corbulo, informing him of his desperate situation. At the same time, the Parthian forces arrived and completely surrounded the Roman camp. The Roman camp was neither well-positioned nor properly fortified. The condition of the legionaries was poor, and they had little confidence in their commander. For this reason, they avoided battle and preferred to remain within their fortifications while awaiting reinforcements. Any soldier who dared to leave the trenches or venture outside the camp was quickly spotted and cut down by the Parthian mounted archers. The morale of the legionaries deteriorated even further as the survivors of the fighting in the Taurus Mountains spread exaggerated tales of Parthian brutality and ferocity. Their horrifying stories filled not only their comrades, but even their commanders with fear. Meanwhile, Vologases dispatched part of his forces to besiege the fortress of Tigranocerta, where a number of Roman soldiers and civilians had taken refuge. The Parthians also carried out repeated probing attacks against the Roman camp in an effort to lure the legionaries into open battle. According to Tacitus, they even approached the Roman positions more closely than usual in hopes of provoking a response. Yet the terrified Romans refused to move from their positions. Day by day, the pressure upon the Romans grew heavier, while their hopes for the arrival of reinforcements steadily faded. At last, Paetus sent an envoy to the Parthian king, requesting a meeting. Vologases selected one of his commanders, Vologases, to meet with the Romans. Tacitus preserves an account of this meeting for us. At the outset, Paetus attempted to remind the Parthians of the victories won by Roman generals such as Lucullus, Pompey, and Caesar in Armenia, seeking to demonstrate that the Romans had always held the upper hand in the region. Vologases, however, calmly replied, "Only the phantom of retaining or lavishing rested with Rome. The reality of that power lay with the Parthians." After lengthy arguments and negotiations, the two sides finally reached an agreement. The Parthians agreed to lift the siege of the Roman camp. In return, however, the Romans were required to withdraw all of their forces from Armenia and surrender all of their forts and supplies to the Parthian army. After the Roman surrender, Vologases compelled the survivors to construct a bridge across the Arsanius River near the Roman camp. Tacitus notes that the purpose behind this order was to demonstrate the totality of the Parthian victory over Rome. In reality, the river itself was shallow enough for horsemen to cross without difficulty. Tacitus further recounts the humiliations the Romans were forced to endure. Among them was the requirement that Roman soldiers pass beneath the yoke, while their weapons and equipment were seized as spoils by the Parthians. In the end, the Parthian king, seated upon a mighty elephant, passed beside the bridge over the Arsanias. Behind him were the great commanders and noblemen of his army, seated upon their armored war horses, while the defeated Romans withdrew in humiliation toward their frontier. According to Tacitus, rumors spread that the bridge had intentionally been built weak so that it would collapse beneath the Parthian king. For this reason, Vologases chose to cross beside the bridge rather than upon it. Later, however, it became clear that the bridge had in fact been strong and secure. 2 days after the disaster at Rhandeia, Corbulo's forces finally arrived. Paetus urged him to launch a joint attack against the Parthians, but Corbulo refused. Filled with bitterness, Corbulo watched as all that he had built in Armenia crumbled before his eyes, while the Roman legionaries suffered in misery. Vologases' Armenian campaign ended in a resounding victory for the Parthians. Although Tacitus provides a relatively detailed and coherent account of the events of 62 AD, the absence of any surviving source from within the Parthian Empire itself prevents us from forming a complete picture of the conflict. Indeed, one of the greatest challenges in reconstructing the history of the Roman-Parthian wars is that nearly all our knowledge of these struggles derives from Roman historians. The overwhelmingly Roman-centered nature of these sources means that the battlefield is usually viewed through the eyes of the Roman command structure. As a result, we possess little direct information regarding Parthian planning, decision-making, or military calculations. This inevitably creates a somewhat passive image of the Parthians, as though they lacked initiative and merely reacted to Roman actions rather than pursuing strategies of their own. For example, in the surviving accounts, Vologases decides to invade Armenia only after Corbulo had sealed the routes leading into Syria, making it appear as though the Parthian king had little choice but to act in Armenia. Likewise, his final victory is presented largely as the result of Paetus's obvious blunders. Yet a more critical reading of these same narratives allows us to consider another possible scenario. It cannot be ruled out that the Parthian movements near the Syrian frontier may have constituted a deliberate diversionary maneuver intended to convince the Romans that Syria was the true target of the Parthian offensive. If this was indeed the case, then by drawing Corbulo to the eastern bank of the Euphrates, the Parthians had effectively achieved their objective of separating the two Roman armies. Under such circumstances, a sudden strike against Armenia could prove devastating, especially one launched during the highly unusual winter season, catching both Roman commanders off guard. Viewed in this light, Vologases' actions appear not merely as a forced reaction, but rather as part of a carefully calculated strategy. The choice of winter for the campaign, together with the concealed movement of the Parthian army, may strengthen the possibility that the operation had been planned well in advance. It is also possible that the Parthian demonstration against Syria, whether intentional or not, created a false sense of security in Paetus. Believing that the main Parthian forces were occupied on another front, he may have attempted to exploit what he perceived as an opportunity by acting with excessive haste. Such an interpretation could help explain why his actions in Armenia were so rushed and reckless. Under this interpretation, our understanding of the campaign of 62 AD changes considerably. In this reading, Vologases appears to have held the initiative from the very beginning of the year, skillfully exploiting both deception and the rivalry between the Roman commanders in order to create the conditions that ultimately led to a major Parthian victory. It must be emphasized, however, that this scenario remains only a hypothesis derived from a critical re-examination of the surviving narratives and from our limited knowledge regarding Parthian political and military strategy. The absence of direct Parthian sources prevents us from treating such an interpretation as definitive, or even necessarily the most probable explanation. Nevertheless, considering such a possibility may help us develop a more balanced understanding of Parthian initiative, capability, and strategic thinking during the campaign of 62 AD, while also allowing us to move beyond the one-sided perspective of the Roman sources. Despite the Parthian victory, the war between the two great powers was far from over. In the next episode, we will follow Corbulo's final campaign in Armenia and the conclusion of the war.